So, in regard to JMac, okay, a thumbnail history, all right. Yes, it's true. MacArthur, I think, will go down in church history, which is really church history and a history of its own, apart from any real New Testament history. But John MacArthur Jr. started out, and this is where his latter-day confusion really comes into focus. He is, I believe, will go down in history as one of the most confused pastors to ever step into the pulpit. All right? But I just want to do a quick thumbnail of where that confusion comes from. MacArthur started out is what we know, and this is for years, as a verse-by-verse historical, grammatical interpreter of the Bible. Okay?
He's the one that did Grace to You, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how many countless hours of Grace to You I listened to when I was growing up. Can't count.
Yeah. Right. So, along with that came a literal interpretation regarding his eschatology. And like all Protestants, he was a functioning reformer in regard to his soteriology, but never really out of the closet as Calvinist till the 90s or so. All right. So
was he really a Calvinist prior to that, or just standard good?
No. Trust me, as one who listened to MacArthur, every cassette tape that there was of a MacArthur, I used to have piles of his tapes in my car, and wherever I went, I was listening to him preach, okay? He talks about how for years and years he went through the whole book of the Bible, verse by verse. I probably listened to 80% of those tapes, okay? He, up until the 90s, probably 1994, he's a historical, grammatical interpreter of the Bible, okay? At least behind closed doors, and this is key, he disavows all of that preaching in the prior years. He disavows it, because here's what happened. You all know the history of the New Calvinist movement, which technically starts in 1970, okay? By the 90s, by the early 90s, the New Calvinist movement, which is Old Calvinism, which was a return to authentic Calvinism, a return to authentic Protestant orthodoxy, really starts picking up steam. Around that time, MacArthur writes the book, help me out.
Believe?
No, come on, the Gospel According to Jesus. Okay. Which I was a big fan of that book, because how I read that book is, finally, somebody's saying the Bible says what it says about sin. Because as a Christian, especially in regard to morals, I become a Christian in 1983, okay? And I'm all, bug-eyed and, bunny ears and everything, and just a big zealot. And I'm reading my Bible and going to church, and I'm like 6 months later, not even 6 months into it, even in the bastion of conservative Baptist theology, I was a student at Criswell Institute for Biblical Studies, okay, I start seeing contradictions and all kinds of problems, and was really thrown into confusion. And at least in regard to historical grammatical interpretation, MacArthur brought clarity. Okay, well, his publication of the Gospel According to Jesus brings down the whole Reformed crowd who had bought into this nameless movement, which was later called the New Calvinist movement, starts converging on John MacArthur. In particular, Michael Horton. Okay? And they really start putting the screws to him. Okay? And John Piper was one of those. So basically, they go to John MacArthur and they say, John, okay, what you're teaching is not right about soteriology and the application of soteriology, and especially what you're teaching about sanctification. It's not what the Reformers taught. And we can prove it. And of course, the reason they were able to, you can thank Robert Brinsmead, the Seventh-day Adventist theologian, for his re-clarification of the Calvin Institutes through his theological journal called Present Truth. Okay? They were able to take that information and show John MacArthur clearly what the Reformers taught about soteriology in regard to the historical redemptive hermeneutic. And guess what? They showed MacArthur, and he had a choice. A historical grammatical interpretation of the Bible, or what the Reformers really taught. And I think we know which one he chose. Okay?
Yeah,
however,
to maintain his social relevance, particularly with those kind of heavy hitters knocking on his door. Those,
right. Right.
I use that term intellectual heavy hitter loosely, but
so.
Well, do you think that was a matter of him genuinely buying into the argument of authentic Protestant orthodoxy, or do you think it was a matter of him towing the line because they had the clout to make his life miserable and he would have faded into obscurity otherwise?
Actually, I'd like to weigh in on that. I think it's a combination of both.
Mm-hmm.
I think intellectually, first of all, so when you concede the premise of your adversary, the only discussion left is how much. And so John MacArthur was already intellectually, he accepted a series of premises that are behind the roots of Calvinism. And so it's almost impossible to genuinely revolt, to genuinely put off an ideology that you already accept the fundamentals on. And so, and the reason I decided I want to weigh in on this is because I've been here. I was exactly here during my time in the organization that resides in so much infamy in my mind, Sovereign Grace Ministries. I had gone to school. I had done the work. I was setting out to make Christianity and theology a professional pursuit. And I remember how hard it was for me to crawl out from underneath that. Now, the one advantage I had, I wasn't in the public eye, so I didn't have to recant a lot of my thinking in public, I guess. But beyond that, I had enough self-possession to be able to walk away and go, you know what, I really don't care about your judgments. Whereas, for John MacArthur, he already holds those fundamental assumptions. And once you hold those assumptions and you get yourself in the middle of Calvin's Institutes, if you ever dare to read it, as long as you can't reject the fundamentals of what Calvin leads with, it's very hard to put off.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that it's, so like I said, I think it's a combination of both.
Just to be clear, when you say fundamentals, you would obviously refer to a lot of tenets that we accepted as confused Protestants, such as original sin, total depravity, the fall of man, Christ's death being an atonement, and all
right.
those things. Because without those, if you don't intellectually follow the conclusions that result from that, which is Calvinism, you have massive contradictions that you cannot reconcile intellectually.
Well, yes, and the advantage of the Platonist construct is that there is no law of identity, so you can have as many contradictions in your head as you should choose, and you just punt the differences into this grand abyss of God's divine mystery. And so you're not on the hook for intellectual consistency. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't surprise me that when someone and you've heard me say this in the tank discussions all the time, the most consistent philosophical system wins. So if you hold things kind of as a hodgepodge of intellectual philosophical framework in your head, when somebody shows up with a more consistent philosophical framework and can challenge your inconsistencies, the inconsistencies fold. And it does not surprise me that John MacArthur ended up folding, and which is also probably why like I said, this interview is a study in intellectual schizophrenia. But hey, it's John MacArthur. He doesn't have an obligation to iron out his thinking on anybody's. Most people, I read through some of the comments on the web, like on Google, and it was obvious to me that most people thought this was one of the best interviews they'd seen.
Oh yeah, sure. So what MacArthur does, he scraps his historical grammatical soteriology, okay, but he holds on to his historical grammatical eschatology, okay, and you heard that in the interview. So I'm kind of getting to the end of the interview here, where he totally disses.
He rejects replacement theology.
Now, where do we get the whole thing with confused Calvinists and Calvinists not knowing what a Calvinist is, blah, blah, blah? 2006, the Shepherds Conference. I believe it was 2006, maybe 2004, the Shepherds Conference. And so MacArthur's got all of his buddies, Reformed buddies, coming to this conference, okay, all these Calvinists. Well, he ambushes them. His opening keynote address goes like this. This is the thesis. You fellow Calvinists that believe in replacement theology, how does that jive with election? On the one hand, we believe in election, okay, but then on the other hand, you believe that even after God elected Israel, that he replaced them with the Gentiles, okay? And the Reformed community this was a big stinking controversy, man. They threw a hissy fit, all right? However, what MacArthur nor all of the Reformed folks that threw a hissy fit understand is actually replacement theology is completely consistent with John Calvin. Because in the Calvin Institutes, there is a temporary election. All right, as you remember, I confronted John Piper about. And to get into the circular argument that John referred to earlier, and we saw it on full display with John Piper, we have
to post that video because it is so classic.
Right.
It is so perfect.
And I think this is what you guys keep referring to. First he starts off, we've got to stick by the whole Calvinistic construct. As Spurgeon said, Calvinism just isn't a nickname. Calvinism is the gospel, sort of thing. And then when I confront John Piper about temporary election,
it doesn't even have to be that. It can be any inconsistency in the whole theological construct of Calvinism.
So
they'll punt and they'll say, well, Calvin's not my authority, the Bible's my authority.
And that's what he said. Calvin's not, that's not what he said at first. First he denied Calvin believed that. And I'm like, well, I got it right here. I go, let me read it. Okay? And
Calvin's not my authority.
Calvin's not my authority. Okay? The Bible's my authority.
This is another part of the intellectual two-step that we constantly see. So people want the historical authority of being installed as Protestants, meaning the Reformers. They want the authoritative credit of that event so that they can then be preachers. But they want to reserve intellectual autonomy when anything that the Reformers said doesn't really jive with what they believe, and then they go, it's not my authority. The Bible is my authority, and so they can do this little happy dance between their historic authority and this biblical authority with not a blush of shame.
Right.
And you, like I said, you see this exact non-shame in the MacArthur interview with impunity.
Right.